So initially, I didn't really intend to talk about this game, and there's two reasons for that. One is that I usually don't have much to say when it comes to these kind of large serialized releases. It isn't a particularly interesting type of game where I tend to find there is much to elaborate on. They're usually just decent, albeit rather generic titles in a long series that deliver a pretty enjoyable experience overall. I also don't really like making negative videos for the most part. Making good games is very hard. It takes talent, time and effort. And honestly, I just don't like denigrating other people's work. That being said, when it is a $60 title from a AAA developer, I think a certain level of quality can fairly be expected. And this game didn't really meet those standards for me. Now, if this was a budding medium-sized game company trying their hands on their first big title, that would be one thing, and I would likely be more lenient in that case. Ubisoft is not that. It's a well-established AAA producer and developer with revenues counting in the millions. So suffice to say, my minimum expectations are somewhat higher. For the sake of full transparency, I want to preface this by clarifying that my interest in the Assassin's Creed series is rather middling. The games are usually pretty decent, albeit rather reiterative, and I play them on occasion but not habitually. I don't diligently or passionately follow this series or play every single game that comes out, and I don't feel a nostalgic connection to it in the same way that I do for something like DSE X or Fallout. On the whole, they tend to have a pretty strong narrative anchored in alternate history, at least the earlier entries did, and the gameplay is relatively simple, with a solidly functional but simplistic combat system and easy to use free-flowing parkour. It is very much a AAA-sized sandbox, with impressive visuals and a decent story. Running around exploring the world, finding collectibles, and even learning a bit about the historic places you inhabit was all very much part of the core experience for these games. I haven't played all of them, but a decent number, those being Assassin's Creed 1, 2, 3 and Revelations. Nevertheless, this is not going to be some kind of long rant of me bashing on a game I don't like. It's not something I particularly enjoy, and I rather find it somewhat unpleasant. Now, if you do find it fulfilling to make a long-format, substantive and constructive critique of media you truly dislike, then all the power to you. I personally don't, and often find it tends more towards the variety of beating a dead horse, but that might be a me problem as opposed to anything else. Either way, unless it's a series I truly adore, I just don't have much interest in making long, exhaustive rants about why something's bad. And I usually don't find it to be necessary either. As the quote goes, albeit perhaps reformulated from its original phrasing, the meaning is as clear as it ever was. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. So with that said, I'm going to stop wasting time here and move on to the subject of the video. Maybe starting with why I want to speak a bit about it in the first place. Well, firstly, I won't be making a long video about it. I promise I won't be rambling for over 10 hours. Sometimes brevity is a virtue, and if a programmer comes with 20 lines of code that does the same as 5, that won't earn him a promotion. The second reason is that I was actually somewhat surprised. I never really expected to find a premium release from Ubisoft that I didn't enjoy, at least in aggregate. The quality of the games from large development houses obviously varies just as anything else does, and a well-known name isn't always a guarantee of superior quality. But with that being said, from what I've played from Ubisoft previously, the games has always fallen somewhere between a great to decent experience. Now, full transparency, I don't tend to pre-purchase games, and I also don't tend to run out and get the latest game if the reception is like that of a train wreck. So I guess my perspective is somewhat biased here, but nevertheless, that's my experience. Well, now I've played Assassin's Creed Syndicate, which is the latest entry in the series I've played to date. And well, I honestly can't say I liked it. Not that it didn't live up to my expectations or wasn't as good as I would have desired, but that it wasn't particularly fun and enjoyable for me to play on aggregate. Sure, there were glimpses of enjoyment, I wouldn't deny that, but a game should preferably be enjoyable 80% of the time you play, not 20%. Anyways, that's kind of the short little explanation for why I'm covering the game. I'm going to go through some of my most significant issues with the game and then wrap it up with a little section with general thoughts. Please keep in mind that this is, as always, my opinion, in the same way that all critiques of entertainment media are. I will of course try to explain and elaborate on my perspective, but it's still my experience and no one else's. Okay, so considering narrative is an important part of Assassin's Creed games, it might be prudent to start off by talking a little bit about that. But honestly, I don't have much to say about it. It felt so utterly uninteresting and uninspired that I don't remember much, honestly. Essentially, it's a couple of assassin twins that fight against the evil Templars that control the city. One of the twins is very much focused on finding the mythical piece of Eden MacGuffin that exists as an obligatory story insert in all Assassin's Creed games, and she basically spends the whole game running around trying to find clues to the location of the hidden tomb where this item is located. The other twin leads a resistance group against the evil overlord Templar man that runs the city. There's not much more to say about him. He's bad, power-hungry, unsympathetic, and an aristocrat. He wants the powerful MacGuffin. I mean, that's pretty much it. I don't really know what else is to say. Everyone is so incredibly one-dimensional and flat. They have no flair or interesting, unexpected characteristics whatsoever. Everyone in this game apparently plays the straight man here. So that's cool, I suppose.
I planned a perfect second out.
Yeah. Look, there's just very little for me to grab onto on this one. There's no mystery, there's barely any tension, there's no red herrings, there's basically no twists or turns in the story. You can essentially always more or less guess what's gonna happen next. The drama between the twins feels very forced and unnatural to me. Probably doesn't help that I don't like either of them, which I'm gonna get onto. I mean, I'm just not feeling it. I'm sorry. It comes off as a straight line from A to B with just no curveballs. It just felt dull. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. Anyways, something in this game that is a little bit unconventional is that instead of focusing the story on following one protagonist that they try to flesh out as much as possible in personality and backstory to make them connect to the player, as all previous Assassin's Creed games has done by the way, they chose to split the narrative between two different characters. This didn't work. It doesn't mean it's an inherently bad idea, mind you, but in this case, no, I don't approve. If the result would have been two great and appealing or intriguing characters with an interesting dynamic, I wouldn't have much of a problem with tackling this additional challenge of crafting two main characters for the same game. But since both are unfortunately rather charmless, uninteresting, underdeveloped and frankly unlikable, I wouldn't say this was ideal. Additionally, the game forces you to switch between the two characters, so there's no picking favorites or choice here. This also, to some degree, impedes your ability to form any kind of personal connection, interest or fondness for the main character. And meanwhile, the present-day character, the kind of animus vessel, is completely ignored. Hell, I don't even think he got a name. Kinda weird. It appears the concept they were going for is the kind of you, the player, is the character, kind of dynamic and presentation. I'm not sure why, since they've always had a real in-game character previously. It has always worked fine and has never been a problem, so I don't really know why they felt they had to make away with that. It's new, I guess. It isn't better, at least not in the way it's done here, but new, so there you go, I suppose. It's not necessarily an inherently bad idea, but it certainly doesn't add anything in this case. There is actually a reason most games just give you one main character. Generally, it's hard to make a player form a kind of bond, fondness, or interest for a character, at least when it's a personality-based one, meaning not self-created RPG character. Unless you're really damn sure of what you're doing when trying to be clever and subvert established frameworks, it's worth considering that they just might be there for a reason, And if you don't know what you're doing, you're probably just gonna make things harder for yourself. It's difficult enough to make one interesting, likable, or relatable main character. Making two? Well there, buddy, you just doubled your workload and turned the difficulty up to hard. Now you will have to build two characters with half the time each, and in this case they should be equally as appealing, more or less. Otherwise you just made half the game worse, since when you're forcing the player to play as both, they'll just be waiting to go back to playing with the one they actually like when playing as the less interesting character. And as mentioned, you also have to split the player's attention between the two as well, meaning you get a much shorter time to develop and build the characters up. This is not to mention that we have the ever so easy to construct sibling relationships in this case as well. It's not inherently bad to have two main characters, not necessarily, it can be done well, but it certainly isn't easier. And in this case, I dislike both of them. Now, when it comes to gameplay, the characters are barely differentiated. One has slightly better stealth abilities and the other can take a few more hits in combat, so they don't feel especially different when you play as them. That's probably a good thing though, and is likely intentional, because they force the player to play as both. You can't choose. This would be infuriating if you strongly prefer the playstyle of one or the other, especially when there's a significant distinction between the two. As a little bit of a bonus, it also entails less work and effort, which is convenient. Maybe they should have thought about that when drafting up the narrative. Either way, they should be more or less interchangeable for anybody moderately competent at the game, I would think. At least that's my experience. So that's brilliant. We got two characters and I hate them both. Wonderful. Mostly because they are uninteresting, insufferable and annoying. But anyways, what else is there? Well, we do have London, which is a pretty cool place, kind of. Well, it has the potential anyways. It has the expected landmarks and doesn't look terrible. Performance can vary somewhat, but it runs fine for the most part. You can always tune down the graphics if the game starts chugging, of course. There are a few famous historical figures as well that are mostly recognizable, I suppose. Let's say that I expect some artistic liberty in constructing the personalities of people that have been dead for over 100 years. So I find that mostly acceptable. Lucky for you, I'm not a professor in British history. That's pretty much it when it comes to the setting itself. It really doesn't feel like you interact much with the city. It feels mostly like set dressing. Most side missions are generic as well. The weapons feels very much similar to other Assassin's Creed games for the most part. There are a few new items, such as the grappling hook thingy that allows you to easily auto-scale buildings, which I suppose is good considering the status of the parkour, but we'll come to that. There is a hidden vault of some kind, which you can unlock by collecting random discs or keys around the city. I sure as hell won't be doing that. And lastly, we of course have the standard collectibles you'd expect in Ubisoft open world games, like beer bottles and pressed flowers. Truly exciting stuff. Okay, I'm being a little bit facetious and overly cynical here, but the city is fine. I would have liked it to have more personality and interesting activities that felt more unique to the 19th century London. But it's fine. Serviceable, at least. Look, it's always harder to evaluate a world in a game that isn't fun to play. And to be entirely fair, I probably would have been slightly less critical if the world was in a game that I actually found enjoyable. But it does feel a little bit generic and lacking in dynamic and meaningful interactions, to be fair. Which is a bit unfortunate, since 19th century London isn't a setting lacking in potential. But this brings me rather neatly to my last point. The mechanics of the game are, well, broken. The parkour is clunky and feels inconsistent. The AI is honestly ridiculous sometimes. The horse carriages are rather annoying and not particularly fun to drive. And sometimes I don't even know what the fuck is going on, happens. And also that. So gameplay is usually front and center for me, and there's only very certain genres where this isn't the case. When it isn't that good, it puts a hamper on the rest of the game as well, since it's a major part of what you do. In this case, I find it to be rather inhibiting, because it isn't fun to run around parkouring, fighting and exploring, which is a bit of a problem when parkour and exploration happen to be a core part of the Assassin's Creed experience. Combat not so much. This naturally means that the act of exploring the city becomes less enjoyable as well, which exacerbates my disinterest in the world. I don't know if it was deadlines, time pressure or what. This hasn't been a problem in prior Assassin's Creed games from what I can tell, but it's pretty silly. Now, it is a premium game from a AAA developer, so it certainly has some appealing qualities, as you might expect. It has pretty good graphics, nice weather effects, good animations, when they work. A pretty neat outfit design and similar. But honestly, unfortunately, I didn't find the game especially enjoyable as a whole. I'm not going to belabor my point here. While quality varies from AAA developers as well, this is a bit below the bar in my opinion. Please note that this does not apply to licensed or casual games, thanks. In respect to Ubisoft specifically, from the games I've played previously, some games are pretty great, such as Far Cry 3 and Splinter Cell, I would say. Some are decent, but perhaps not amazing. And a few are a little bit more mediocre, while still completely serviceable and relatively enjoyable. I'm honestly not going to add examples here, because I have made enough enemies as it is, and I will save that for another video. Thanks. But this time around, I just didn't have a particularly good time, frankly. I don't know if I've grown out of the Assassin's Creed series as I've gotten older and more experienced with games. That is possible. But at the end of the day, this was my experience. I haven't kept up with all the Ubisoft titles. There's way too many games out there that are more interesting and experientially different for me to justify playing all the infinitely continuing series Ubisoft has established. Not that there aren't any games that have caught my interest from time to time, but after this experience, well, I can't really say I'm itching to run out and get the next subsequent release. Now, with all this having been said, this isn't the worst game in the world. It certainly has a number of disruptive and annoying bugs, but it's nothing game-breaking for the most part. It has never crashed for me, which is certainly appreciated. It also isn't offensive in any way. It doesn't disparage or disrespect previously beloved characters. It doesn't ruin pre-existing story arcs or anything like that. But it also doesn't really do much of anything. It's just bland. There's clearly many games out there that are worse or less enjoyable, just more broken than this game. But at the same time, for a premium price, you would expect a premium experience, and this kind of just wasn't it, in my opinion. There is worse experiences you can, well, experience. There is worse games out there. There's actually no question about that. That's obvious. But that also isn't the scale I grade it on. Just because there is worse games out there doesn't mean I can't criticize this one. And considering it is a AAA experience that was sold at $60, I'd expect something that's pretty decent. And in my opinion, this didn't really reach the level of quality that I would expect for a AAA game. At the end of the day, I can only speak of my own experience, and my experience in this case was, well, rather mediocre and middling. There were certainly points where I saw potential for sure, but at the same time, there were way too many instances where I was frustrated by weird or broken mechanics. And the story, meanwhile, mostly had me disinterested and bored. While it's not the worst experience in the world, it's entertainment media. It's supposed to be interesting and invigorating and engaging. not just endurable. But I think I've done more than enough complaining at this point. And if you like the game, well, that's great. And I certainly hope that you will continue liking it, despite the fact that I don't. Because my opinion certainly shouldn't have any consequence for what you derive enjoyment from. And that's final. Maybe I'll see you next time.